Welcome to the Pastor's Pulse for March 9th, 2022. This is part 2. Can we say anything at all about the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 4? Well, the first view of this phrase says they were angels who lusted after human women, came down to earth in bodies of flesh, took wives for themselves, and produced corrupted offspring who may or may not have been gigantic. Well, this view is popular and ancient, but I think this view falls short of being plausible. The objections, in my mind, are significant and fatal. First, there is no direct tie to the context of Genesis. Right? We have to appeal to other Old Testament texts like Job 1:6, 2:1, and 38:7, or to New Testament ones like 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6. The former, the Old Testament, are said to prove that the sons of God refers to angels, while the latter are supposed to confirm the immoral conduct of the angels in Noah's day. However, we noted last time that the phrase sons of God in Job doesn't necessarily need to refer to angels, at least not in every instance. So it provides weak evidence at best for that meaning in Genesis 6. What about Peter and Job? Well, Peter mentions angels who sinned, and Jude, angels who did not keep their proper domain. It has to be assumed that in these two instances, it is talking about intermarriage with human women. There's nothing in either passage which speaks directly to the events of Genesis 6. The second objection has to do with the punishment that is promised in verse 3, where Yahweh says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. This judgment is later described in more detail as the destruction of, quote, man whom I have created from the face of the earth, in verse 7, the end of all flesh, in verse 13, and flood waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die," in verse 17. This judgment was directed against man, not angels, which is akin to punishing the victims rather than the perpetrators of this heinous evil. In response, someone might say that Peter and Jude are describing precisely this judgment of the angels for their part in this sin. But this is not actual evidence in favor of the view. It just demonstrates that this view is possible. And we can imagine many ways that are possible to explain Bible difficulties, but we need to have real evidence, and imagination is not evidence. A third difficulty arises from Jesus' words in the Gospels, that the angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage. He says this in Matthew 22, verse 30, Mark 12:25, and Luke 20, verses 35 and 36, though that quote was taken from the Matthew passage. Ironically, in Luke 20, when Jesus refers to those who share in the resurrection, he calls them sons of God. And the angels, he calls simply angels. It's not just that angels are spiritual rather than material beings, however. Jesus said specifically they do not marry, which is precisely what Genesis 6 says the sons of God did to the daughters of men. And furthermore, the supposition that angels mated with human women involves a huge number of assumptions, which stretch credulity to the breaking point. When angels appear in physical form, do they have the capability of performing all the functions of a human body? When they eat food, for instance, Genesis 18, verse 8 speaks of this. Does that mean they digest it? Do they obtain nutrients from it and then rid themselves of the waste products by urination and defecation? Do angels have DNA? Are they capable of producing sperm, which can fertilize a normal human ovum? There is no reason to think any of this is true of angels, other than a desire to justify this view of Genesis chapter 6. The angels as sons of God view really seems to be fatally flawed then, in my opinion. Next, we turn to the Cainite and Sethite view. This view holds that the sons of God refers to the godly descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men were the descendants of the godless Cain. This view has the benefit of appealing to the preceding context of Genesis 4:16 to 5:32, where Moses appears to draw an intentional contrast between the godless line of Cain and the godly line of Seth. It is supposed that intermarriage between the two lines threatened to pollute the entire race of mankind and put in jeopardy the seed promise of chapter 3, verse 15, by turning the whole race into godless pagans. Now, there's a certain kind of symmetry here with the warnings that Moses gave to the children of Israel against marrying pagan women of Canaan, for instance, in Deuteronomy 7, 3 and 4. And we have to remember that Moses is writing Genesis, presumably during the years of wilderness wandering, for the benefit of those same Israelites. So Genesis 6 could serve as an argument against mixing God's chosen people with pagans. This view also has the added benefit of not depending on an obscure text like 2 Peter 2:4 or Jude 6. Those passages then probably refer to the initial fall of angels. But even if they don't, they have no bearing on the events which brought about the flood, if this view is correct. There would also be no logical connection with the three uses of sons of God in Job, since by this time, the lines of Cain and Seth would be irrelevant. All of the Cainites and most of the Sethites were wiped out in the flood. This essentially turns Genesis 6 into a kind of interpretive island, without reference to any other portion of Scripture. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this view is false, but I think it does weaken the argument. Another problem with this view is that it requires us to use two different definitions of the word men and daughters in the first two verses of chapter 6. In verse 1, these words refer to mankind in general. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. But in verse 2, according to this view, the daughters of men refers only to the women of the godless line of Cain. Unfortunately, there's no indication that such a change is in the text. It must be supposed in order to accommodate this view. One final point about this view is that it doesn't offer any explanation for the identity of the giants or Nephilim of verse 4. Why should the offspring of believers and unbelievers be anything other than normal human children? Accordingly, proponents of this view point out that verse 4 does not say that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. It just says that they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. This may be true, but it does seem as though Moses intends us to see some connection between them in this verse. But I will admit that it's not really an objection against that view. Still, when we consider the arguments for and against the second major view, it also seems to fall short. At the least, we are left looking for an explanation which may be closer to the intention of the text of Genesis, without requiring us to bend the rules of grammar. The third major view on the identity of the sons of God and daughters of men in Genesis 6 is what we're going to talk about next.